Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for our final webinar of April in this this sort of 3-webinar series. I looked at the calendar and I realized, wait a minute, we scheduled this whole thing in the month of April, and so it's been kind of a whirlwind to get everything knocked out over the past couple of weeks. But we're very glad to have our 3 guests here today. Mary Martha Thiel, I'll introduce her, but she's having some technical difficulties, so I'll be talking to her in the chat and see if we can get that resolved. But in the meantime, we will rely on Vanessa and Jason to guide us through. So what I'll do, this will be just like the rest of the webinars that the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab does. I'll introduce our guests, and then we will just open it up for the sort of general conversation that we always have. So we're joined today by Mary Martha Thiel, Director of CPE Hebrew Senior Life. And I can hear the Zoom lady talking on Mary Martha's phone, so she should be joining us here very quickly. So Mary Martha is at Hebrew Senior Life up near Boston, Massachusetts. Vanessa Gomez-Brake is, you're going to have to help me out with your title because I talk with so many higher ed chaplains that I forget. Are you the dean of this? Are you the senior chaplain of this? But she is the boss chaplain at UC.
So my official title is Associate Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California.
At USC. See, I'm a Notre Dame grad. I should know this. I apologize. Okay. And then finally, rounding out our panel, we have Jason Torpy, who is the Executive Director of the Military Atheists, MAAF. Help me out, Jason. The technical difficulties have thrown me off. MAAF. Or Matt, MAFF.
The Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, and probably for these purposes, I'm the endorsing agent for the Humanist Society, which endorses chaplains and other clergy.
Very good. And so we may have a couple of chaplains that are in our audience that don't necessarily work in a framework that requires endorsement. So just to sort of get up to speed there, that means that Jason's body is the endorsing body for chaplains who are humanist, just like any other denomination would endorse their chaplains to do whatever work in whatever setting it might be. So I'm very glad that we are all here together today. Mary Martha, I'm going to ask you if you can hear us, and hopefully I see you nod. All right, she can hear us now. Fantastic. Okay, well, let me just start out with our very basic general question, and that is, how did you all end up doing what you were doing? This is such a new field of chaplaincy or spiritual care, however you want to refer to it. Mary Martha, why don't you start us off, since let's celebrate you getting back in. So how did you end up being Director of CPE at Hebrew Senior Life? I think you're going to have to unmute yourself, Mary Martha, because I can't do it. It won't let me. There we go.
Okay, and
Mute your speakers to avoid that while you're talking.
yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
It's a button on the screen.
There we go.
Hover over your face.
Yeah, is that better?
Hover over your face and it will mute your computer.
I think your phone is in the audience and not. Can you turn your phone volume down?
Mute your computer.
All right, let me try to mute my computer. Get it.
You should mute too while she's talking, Michael.
Just gonna look here through the.
Sorry, mute your speakers, Mary Martha, not your voice. So you muted your microphone, you want to mute your speakers. That way your speakers don't cause feedback while you're talking. So unmute your thing there and just mute your computer so you can't hear anything from the computer. Okay, your microphone is still muted. So unmute your microphone and then mute your speakers. So there's no sound coming out, there's only sound going in.
So I think what we'll do is, Jason, let's move on to you. I'm going to chat with Mary Martha here in the text function. Jason, the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, I am going to wager that many of our attendees have not heard of that organization off the top of my head, although I'm happy to be corrected. Folks, let me know in the Q&A if I'm wrong. So how did you end up doing what you are doing?
Well, we do try to get the word out. I enlisted in 1994. Part of that experience was being forced to attend church services, even, and seeing the privilege that, some local churches had to where basic trainees had one opportunity to leave the installation. And that was to go to a sermon off the installation, fire and brimstone, not a church service, fire and brimstone. Little Sally was 7 years old and got hit by a car, and now she's in hell because she didn't get saved. That was part of the sermon for that day, and that was a special privilege given to that church. It has since been ended, but it was almost 20 years later before it was ended. Since I went, so that was a whole cadre of chaplains at that basic training installation, which was at Fort Leonard Wood, that thought that was a good idea. And, I hope that all the chaplains here today can think to themselves, not just for the non-theists, but, for everyone, diversity is important. Chaplains should be there to protect those, especially those who aren't in the majority. And more importantly, when we have a broad view of what, religion and values and meaning and purpose in life is, instead of a one-size-fits-all solution, then chaplains become more and more valuable to their institutions. Chaplains are better able to justify their value, to increase their staff and their resources, to increase their mandate, and to really be appreciated throughout their institutions and throughout the culture. And I'm really on board with everyone here and trying to get to a point where when somebody says I'm a chaplain, nobody ever says, oh, well, I'm atheist, so, I don't want a chaplain, right? That doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, that is sort of a whole set of questions that we haven't had to deal with in some other settings, and so I want to circle back to that as well and introduce our other two panelists. Vanessa, you next. You had an interesting path to where you are now, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting being introduced as an associate dean of religious life and then letting people know I'm a secular humanist and an atheist. And so my particular path was interesting in that from the very beginning, I was curious about religion. And ended up majoring in it at Arizona State University. And so I'm Filipino. I grew up on the island of Guam, and if you know anything about the Philippines or the Pacific Islands, it's predominantly Roman Catholic. And so I am culturally Catholic. It's one of those identities that cannot really be pulled apart from being Filipino. And so while I am an atheist, I do have 5 godchildren who I provide spiritual, guidance to. And so that's a bit of some complexity there for those of you who may think that all atheists are anti-religious or anti-theist. In fact, I get along quite well with religious folks and atheists and people across the belief spectrum. So I think in terms of how I arrived at university chaplaincy, it came from my own experience studying at Arizona State University. Really, while I was doing the academic study of religion, I got extra credit to go be a part of inter-worldview dialogue. And so most of us call that interfaith dialogue, right? But at Arizona State, they called it inter-worldview dialogue. And so as an atheist, I was like, oh, wow, there might be space for me there. And I really appreciated it. I was the minority, the sole atheist in that room, but what it provided me was a space amongst peers for the first time to really articulate my non-belief. And that's powerful for a young adult to be able to express one's sort of existential questions amongst those who don't share your beliefs, but who are open to being in a space and respectful of each other's divergent beliefs to really engage those tough questions. And so instantly I was hooked. And I've been doing interfaith or interworldview work for over a decade now in a variety of settings. And so prior to coming to USC in 2017, I had the opportunity to serve at the Office for Religious Life at Stanford University for several years. And no joke, I was the atheist in the church. I ran Sunday services. I made sure everyone was in the place, from the sextons to the liturgical oversight of our program. So I'm a bit of an expertise on Christian religious practice. But what's great about coming from that context was, yes, I was in the church, but Stanford had an interfaith center as well. And so I got to advise a variety of religious groups there. And luckily, USC was progressive enough in its thinking to invite me to take on the helm and really oversee all religious and spiritual life on this very big campus. So I'll end there, but I look forward to telling you a bit more about my work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa. Mary Martha, let's try it. Let's try it again. Now
Is it better now, I hope?
Try turning your phone volume all the way down.
Okay. There we go. That's as good as it's going to get.
I think we're going to live with it.
All right. All right.
All right.
My apologies for all the technology. So I'm an ACPE certified educator, and I went into chaplaincy because I really loved the liminality of working across the religious world and the medical world. And I grew up in a family that had a refugee father from Europe and an American mother. And that in and of itself created lots of questions of meaning for me as a kid. So I've always been someone who's been very interested in the search for meaning. And chaplaincy is a wonderful place to swim in those kinds of waters. I was exposed to all kinds of, I love the term interworld. The sound quality is pretty.
Yeah, I think we began a feedback loop that was pretty vicious there. I'm wondering if you could turn your computer volume all the way down, if that would do anything for us.
Yeah, Michael, if you mute yourself while she's talking, that will help as well, because it's coming through your speakers to your mic as well. And also, Mary Martha, when you're talking, if you just hold for a minute, it'll stop that feedback.
All right, Mary Martha, let's give it a shot.
I was exposed to, this is still going to do it.
You're okay right now.
Okay. I was exposed to, I love the term interworld, exposure and dialogue. Vanessa, that's a new term for me, throughout my childhood. And chaplaincy seemed a wonderful way to continue that, that exploration of the world and how people make meaning. So in my first professional chaplaincy job, I was the only Protestant on staff, and I worked in a Catholic hospital. So that stretched me in a particular way. And then I became an educator and was exposed to many more traditions. Always found myself very open to people who didn't use religion for their meaning-making system. The church that I grew up in was the United Church of Christ. I studied that congregation once during a sociology of religion class, and many of its members considered themselves atheists. So I grew up in a world where I felt very fluent in both a religious worldview and a secular worldview. that had very strongly humanist values. And throughout my career, I've enjoyed being able to do the code switching that is necessary in chaplaincy. Several years ago, I was really fortunate to get a grant through the Louisville Institute to work on spiritual care of the non-religious. Because I work in a context with elders, elder care in the Jewish world, there are a lot of people that we serve here who, although they identify as being Jewish, would say, oh, I'm not religious. And so I wanted to drill down and understand more clearly what that meant. And it was at that point that I started doing much more official study and then teaching and writing and sharing about what spiritual care looks like in these contexts. So that's a little bit of my journey of how I got to this particular topic.
I want to pick up immediately on a term that Mary Martha just used, which is code switching. And I came across this sort of directly in work that I did in the past with chaplains that are working in seaports, where code switching ends up being a very important part of their job because those areas are so highly regulated and policed that and at the same time, they're also run by corporate interest as well. So there's a business aspect of this as well. And so for someone to come up and talk with very overtly religious or spiritual terminology could be a limiting factor. They're trying to work with people that are on ships, and if they sort of hit people over the head with the chaplaincy side of things, they can't get on. And so code switching was just a constant thing that they did. Vanessa and Jason, I'm wondering about the type of code switching that you find yourselves having to do. I mean, Vanessa, you gave this great image of organizing Christian worship, and so I would imagine there is a great deal of code switching going on there. But Jason, I'm imagining the same thing for you, because as you indicated earlier, military chaplaincy is so traditionally denominational, and certainly by the numbers Christian denominational. With growing numbers of Muslim chaplains now for sure, and soldiers as well. So what does code switching look like in the settings that you're working at now? And does the phrase chaplain even make any sense for what you're doing?
So does it make sense for humanists? Again, I didn't talk a lot about my background. Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers is kind of like a ministry. It's a regular nonprofit, and we go out and help atheists and humanists, and it's not denominational, as it were, but, it's an atheist organization with humanist values. But it's kind of like a ministry, whereas the Humanist Society is a proper church. It's not even just an endorsing agency. It's, it's the denomination of humanism. And there's others, ethical culture, humanistic Judaism. Those are, organizations with actual church bodies that kind of have a certain profession that they put out in the world. And the Humanist Society is one of them as well. And that's why we do that endorsement. But just to speak to your question, in the military, it's not about code switching in the military. They are diverging. They have basically diverged entirely from chaplaincy, in my opinion. There's a lot of good chaplains in the military. There's a lot of good people in the Veterans Administration. So I'm not saying solely that they're problematic, but they've turned their back on humanist chaplaincy entirely, and really have a negligible population of non-Christian chaplains. Even Jewish chaplains are technically overrepresented and have pretty solid percentages relative to their population, but it's really kind of hard to call what's going on in military chaplaincy, and not just kind of ministry, Christian ministry in the military. And it's been really encouraging to see the Association of Professional Chaplains, ACPE, CPSP as well, College of Clinical Pastoral or Education, and then College of Pastoral Care and Supervision.
It's the alphabet soup.
But all those organizations, all the civilian organizations, have really embraced humanist chaplaincy, and and I'm doing a lot of work to try to ensure that our chaplains embrace that professional community as well. We have speakers coming up at APC. Jason Callahan will be on stage. He's one of our chaplains. And we have chaplaincy certification through ACPE as well. And, you know, we just want to take advantage of the opportunities that we have in the civilian chaplaincy profession to do the hard work of chaplaincy and to really prove ourselves, because our people need help. And the tradition that we have is believers in the chaplaincy taking care of non-believers. And it needs to really switch, just like any diversity approach, to where non-believers are in the positions, are within the profession as well. You know, not being supported by believers in the profession, but actually welcomed in the profession, willing to do the work in the profession. And, you know, so we have a certain switching point where it's not code switching so much as you know, these sorts of diversity ideas and themes are part of the profession itself. And there's not like an in crowd and other crowd that you have to code switch between. Everybody becomes in the in crowd. And I'd like to see that continue more within, you know, at least the civilian chaplaincy, so that we can all kind of together turn and really start to question what's going on in the military chaplaincy.
Vanessa, I'm really interested to know, you know, on a public campus like USC, I'm assuming that there is a fairly robust structure for the spiritual life of every student. And I'm also guessing, again, this is a complete guess, but I'm guessing that your staff is fairly diverse in its religious makeup. So is there any sort of like pairing of, all right, you take care of these people and you take care of these people, or is it whoever happens to be in the office that day, and then you just figure out what to do on the fly? That's a really brute way of saying it, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me provide a little context, because you're sort of alluding to it. And I imagine most people are aware of the diversity of Los Angeles, but let me just give you a glimpse as to what my campus looks like. I am one of 3, what you might call university chaplains. We're deans of religious life. And we provide oversight for spiritual and religious needs for nearly 45,000 students, 28,000 staff members, and the broader community of Los Angeles that finds itself on this campus. And so we have an open door policy here, which means I receive any student, staff, or community member who comes through the door. And so to your question of code switching, you know, it's interesting because as a person of color, I understand code switching from the perspective of how I relate amongst my people. But in this context, we're talking about how we relate professionally, right, between staff versus student versus community member. And so in terms of code switching, anyone who walks through my door, I need to be prepared to hear where they're coming from, their particularities of contexts, backgrounds, as well as where they stand now, in order to be of service to them. And so I will say that it's funny because nearly, I think it was the last time we took the data of the incoming class, 44% of students did not want to be boxed into a religious label. So they either forgo the label entirely, or they, you know, they mark other or non-religious or just something other, none, right? And so I do tend to see a lot of students and staff in crisis, and I have to laugh because sometimes they'll come in, they'll sit on my couch, they'll be crying or otherwise, you know, in a dire situation. But then at some point, once they sort of calm down, they might say, I'm so sorry, I'm not religious, but this was the only place I thought to seek support. And so, and whether I had the opportunity to even provide my particular worldview or so forth is what makes it laughable, because they were coming in expecting to talk to someone who's religious, and I may share in their non-belief. So anyhow, because I do provide oversight of more than 100 student-led religious groups and nearly 50 religious directors who we endorse to provide spiritual care on our campus, every conversation is in a different language, I guess you would say, because I have to be well-versed in a variety of faith traditions and non-traditions, such that I can be of service whoever I'm speaking to.
Mary Martha, what does that look like in the senior care setting? I mean, it occurs to me that we're, and I keep doing these gestures because the 3 of you are at the top of my screen. So, you know, on my screen, I'm pointing at you, but the 3 of you are dealing with 3 enormously different populations. Aside from the fact that we're talking about a common audience of non-believers, but Vanessa's at a university, Jason's working with military people, and Mary Martha, you're in a senior setting. What does spiritual care look like for non-believers in an elder care setting?
Looks like a huge range of things. For many of our people, it looks like intense, relational, supportive care, a sense of belonging, a sense of having relationships that provide meaning and comfort and interest and stimulation. And an outsider might look at them and think, I wouldn't necessarily know that that's a chaplain having a conversation. What a chaplain is going to know is what their assessment framework is and how they are actually responding to particular needs in the way that they're focusing their activities and their energies and work with that person. So that's sort of the professional part of what they're doing. With some of our folks, even though they say they're not religious, they do want to do cultural things related to being Jewish, sometimes going to services as well. So as Vanessa was saying, that being culturally Catholic is part of being Filipino, being culturally Jewish can involve certain kinds of activities and rituals. So I would say that spiritual care is going to be quite individual from person to person, and it's our job as chaplains to figure out what that looks like for the individual in front of us, and what combination of religious, not religious, time, activity makes sense for that person in front of us, relating to themes like love and belonging, trust, meaning, legacy, identity, those kinds of really core human experiences that religion speaks to, humanism speaks to, worldviews speak to.
That's so interesting, sort of what Vanessa said about being culturally Catholic. Mary Martha, you're working with people who identify as culturally Jewish. Jason, if we sort of pick up on the anecdote that you told at the beginning, I would imagine that there is a lot of sort of shedding that cultural baggage for people who identify as humanist or atheist. If we think about the sort of trip off post and how that was maybe not the best representation of what it could have been. There is a growing body of literature of spiritual care in all of these settings, higher ed, the military, healthcare. But most of that research literature is predicated on some sort of religious or spiritual belief on the part of the patient or the student or the soldier or whatever. And from what I know of that literature, specifically in the military case, is there is this growing idea of moral injury and what does it mean to carry out violent acts or be subjected to violent acts. And you find service members asking themselves things like, why did God let this happen to me? What does this do to my relationship to God? All of that sort of thing. I am wondering, in the case of humanist or atheist, do they have spiritual care needs that religiously committed chaplains are just not prepared to deal with because the questions are so different? Or is it not really that different at all?
Well, I think prepared is what you said. I think highly of chaplains as a whole. I've had a lot of bad experiences, like I like to be upfront about, but people on this call seem to be nice enough. You're willing to listen, and I've met a lot of good chaplains, and I'm 100% confident that religious chaplains, believing chaplains, those who kind of rely on the idea of an afterlife or a plan, a divine plan, those chaplains can translate and understand the perspective of a non-theist and provide for that at least to a certain extent. I think it's really important. One of the most important rules, I talk to a lot of chaplains I go to national chaplain conferences every year, not APC, but, military conferences primarily. And a lot of chaplains very gleefully tell me how, they talk to atheists, right? And they had a conversation with them. Great. I mean, that's awesome and everything, but, and I'm sure that they did kind of a good job in that moment. But the important thing is to have, hand them materials from atheists and humanists. Mary Martha has done a lot of studies on this, and she talked to humanist chaplains, which is great, right? If you're talking about us, make sure you're talking to us. Okay. And if you're talking to one of our, patients or prisoners or military personnel, talk to one of our professionals as well. Call up humanist clergy, in the local area, call up, me as an endorser while I, focus on the military ministry through MAF. The Humanist Society endorses in all contexts. We have, pediatric oncology, and we have, hospice care, and we have we don't have military chaplains actively, but we have a lot of people, essentially doing their job for them, to help our people. But we endorse for all those contexts, and we have a concern for all those contexts. But the important thing is humanists can provide services to Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims. Buddhists can serve Jews and Hindus and Seventh-day Adventists. Chaplaincy is about going outside your comfort zone and understanding the views of others, and providing them the service they need. And a humanist chaplain is perfectly willing to sit down and say, and guide somebody through a prayer, even if they don't necessarily believe themselves. And we expect Christians to sit down and have a conversation. Going back to your example of moral injury, for a Christian, they have to kind of reconcile this atrocity with God's plan. They have to reconcile this atrocity with, suffering and evil in the world, theodicy, those sorts of questions. But for us, the world's a bad place, right? Bad things happen. And sometimes it happens for no reason. That can be, a liberating path to explain, it's really bad that, you died and somebody else died and you didn't. But nobody's out to get you. There's no divine power that could have stopped it. There's no divine power that decided it was a good idea. Those are all moral injuries you don't have to fix for somebody's humanist or not theist, right? What you have to address is losing a friend, a purpose in life that's an issue. A lot of times, a lot of the discussions I have is to say, hey, the United States of America did a bad thing politically, through war, drone strikes, casualties in war, collateral damage, pollution, things like that. These are, the crisis of face for us is when humans act badly. So we have to figure out how to find our purpose and to reconnect with the meaning in life that we have. And that connection with meaning is a very valid and very important approach. And it hinges on the one life that we have to live, not, rather than a divine plan. But there still is an anchor that we're all connected to from a value standpoint, from a belief standpoint.
You mentioned just a minute ago, sort of this diverse constellation of chaplains, and then you have the diversity of the audience. And in a perfect world, anybody from the chaplain group can speak to anybody in the sort of the recipient of spiritual care group. That's all fine and well for practicing chaplains. But a few weeks ago, we had our webinar on Muslim chaplaincy, and we had a great conversation on what would Muslim CPE look like, since in the United States, CPE is in almost every case, it's predicated on the Christian history of chaplaincy in the United States. And so people from non-Christian faiths are going through these programs, and they have to kind of learn to adapt and make it make sense for them. How could training for chaplaincy change and be more useful for humanists? And I'm not saying, let's dog on training programs now, but what would a really good training program, a degree or CPE, look like for humanist chaplaincy? What needs to be kind of taught for it to be really effective?
Well, I'm only going to speak very briefly on this. I think Mary Martha is the expert, but we have a humanist in CPE training now, and it's fine. I've been there and I presented to their chaplains, unless we make the assumption that, CPE being predicated on Christian history is perfectly valid. A lot of humanists, while, the Jewish community is more connected with their culture, and it's very common for somebody to be Jewish and atheist. If you look at the humanist community and the way we express, there's a lot of, Christian background and Christian culture here in the United States, because that's, just the prevailing culture in the United States. And to the extent a CPE program is, has Christian elements or history, that's not necessarily a big deal. If it requires, church every Sunday, and requires privileging and prioritizing Christianity to the exclusion or to the very, very great marginalization of other communities, then I'm sure I will say the ACP would consider that a problem program, right? I don't think the ACP has an undue bias on Christianity. They may have a history, but that's fine. They don't, but I would not accept the premise that they have an undue bias towards Christianity. So keep doing what you're doing, CPE, I think.
Vanessa, I'm about to drop into the chat a link to a white paper on the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab website. It's a shameless plug, but I'm going to put it in there, to a white paper that was authored by a student at Brandeis named Becky Barton on what spirituality looks like on campuses. Since you're at USC, which is this enormous institution at a major metropolitan area, I know you've only been there since 2017, so kind of the time frame is fairly compressed, but what does the sort of spiritual demographic look like on campus? And do you see it as kind of representing the rest of the country, or is this, sort of the old example of college campuses being way different from everything else?
No, I think what I love about Los Angeles is that every faith and non-faith tradition is really represented in the microcosm of my university. And so I get to see and work with very, very religious students. And I have to be able to be of service to them too. So whether it's Orthodox Jews, or Muslim students, evangelical Christians, or so forth, I am a chaplain to them as well. So I see these students at my university religious center. But I guess the good news is that these secular students who may not have even known that they were coming to the religious center are finding programs that really serve them as well. And so it's kind of a trick here at USC. So on this campus, we refer to every building by a 3-letter code. And so people can be at the University Religious Center, the URC, and not know they're in a religiously, designated space. And in some ways that serves us. But I will say we have a very thriving secular student fellowship on campus. And I really believe in letting students lead, because they are seeking connections and seeking programming that is of interest to them. And so I just follow their lead. But I guess in terms of your question regarding the demographics, I have also noted that other than the very religious students, that there are a lot of students who were not brought up in religious households, or they're not well versed in religious language, which means they may even have a God concept or theological outlook that is based on supernaturalism, but they're not using the language of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or so forth. And so even having to meet their existential needs is something that is always, kind of challenging me, because if they're not using the language of tradition, then really they're speaking a new language. And so I think I'll go ahead and plug it now. And I imagine a lot of you have already read this book. Elizabeth Drescher, she did the book, it came out last year, Choosing Our Religion. And she went and there's a ton of research on the nuns. But what she did was she went and she interviewed them very intensely. And she just showed really how complex their belief system is. And really what Mary Martha was saying, you have to meet the individual. There's no one, you know, atheist, humanist, or so forth. Everyone's coming with a different background. And so, but what Elizabeth Drescher does is she looks at how spiritual practice comes in the form of family, friends, food, and Fido, and how those 4 F's provide sort of the meaningful activities that really serve to ground a person spiritually, whether or not they're using the language of spirituality or religion.
One of the things that that we have said sort of within the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab from the very beginning is that you know, we are just sort of observing all of these trends, whatever direction they might go. So we're not cheerleading them. We're not trying to slow them down. We're just saying, here's where things are going. And so there was just a report that came out a couple of weeks ago, and there's a news item on the lab's website that, you know, that non-believers are now one of the largest groups in the United States, which means if that continues, that chaplains, no matter what setting they're in, they're going to come into contact more and more with non-believers. That's just where the demographics are going. And so this is a much needed skill. Now, we always want to make sure that people can take something away from our webinars. So I'm going to put up a slide that we were discussing yesterday with some resources on this. But while I'm doing that, let me turn it over to you all and get your recommendations for chaplains, wherever they might find themselves, believers or not, chaplains who are looking to sort of grow this particular skill set, become better chaplains to non-believers. What sorts of things should they be doing? What kind of resources should they seek out? What does that sort of branch of professionalization look like? I'm going to turn that to you while I'm bringing up this slide.
I'll start, and this is partly an answer to the question here. The slide has the info. The trick is not to go online and look for a list of resources. That's not a bad thing to do, but reach out and contact, you know, Vanessa or myself, you know, even Mary Martha, she has connections. But talk to humanists, talk to humanist chaplains, talk to humanist clergy, connect with humanist communities, and get a humanist at the table. You know, an actual person who's dedicated to doing this well. And one quick note, you know, I would very much like to see a program at one of your institutions to do a proper study on in-processing forms. You know, how patients are, you know, for hospitals in particular, are brought into the community and asked these sorts of, you know, what's your religion question? What do you want from the chaplain questions? To ask those in a way that connects with diversity, that connects the chaplains with non-believers, and, you know, does so in a way that's not just Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, other. So if anybody's interested in that, definitely let me know.
I think I'll just add that as you see on the slide, the Humanist Society is listed there, and they do have a directory of humanists. A lot of them are celebrants, but there's also a good deal of chaplains as well. And Jason, of course, has a background on the board and so forth, and knows a lot of these people. But I will say, before I went to Chicago Theological Seminary, I had done 3 years of graduate level training with the Humanist Institute, which is now called the American Humanist Association Center for Education. And while they are focused on educating humanists to be in leadership roles, and those are the folks you see at the Humanist Society, there's a lot of resources on both those websites in terms of particular needs for this group of spiritual care needs. So yeah, the top 2 are the ones I recommend.
And in terms of some of available resources, there are articles and webinars available through the ACPE website and the APC website that are specifically about spiritual care, mostly focused on healthcare settings, not so much military and not so much university.
Yeah, Mary Martha, of course, the healthcare setting tends to have because that's how it has shaken out. The healthcare setting tends to have the most research associated with it in almost any any circumstance, not just how to deal with specific beliefs, atheism, humanism, but just any question. Healthcare kind of dominates the field. So I'm going to use the opportunity to say we need so much more research in this area, no matter what setting someone is in, whether it's university, healthcare, the military, prisons, whatever. This is something that we really need some high quality research in. So for those of you who are in the audience who are interested in research and like doing that sort of thing, please absolutely pursue these questions, because they are something that we need to think about very hard. And the literature is just not as well developed as it should be, and we look forward to a day where there is more to actually read on this, and we can inform ourselves a little bit better. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here, so let me just open the floor very quickly to see if there's anything else that you all would like to add, and if not, we'll get you on with your afternoon.
I think maybe two things I would add, and I don't know how much of our audience is interested in university chaplaincy, but for those of you who are serving on university campuses or even high schools or whatever the setting is with young adults, I would highly recommend the Secular Student Alliance. I'm lucky enough to have Ryan Bell also serving as a humanist chaplain on my campus, but he helps organize campus efforts nationwide for different secular student groups. And so they are a great resource, and I get to host their annual conference on my campus this summer. So if you want to come hang out with me in the dorms at USC, please sign on for that in July. And then additionally, I think this is a resource many people probably would have already heard of, but Convergence, under the leadership of Cody Nielsen, he looks at religious, spiritual, and secular identities on university campuses, and his website and his colleagues have a wealth of resources for those in my particular context.
I want to say, for people who are training to be chaplains through the CPE process, that CPE is a wonderful way to expand one's sense of interworld worldviews and how to be respectful. So the story that Jason opened with feels like a really tragic one to me. And my hope is that by having much better education for professional chaplains, that kind of thing won't happen in the name of professional chaplaincy. That's not what it's about.
And I appreciate that. I mean, Mary Martha is a believer who's done a lot of work. Is a good example of reaching out to the non-theist community to serve us better. That's good chaplaincy. I think it needs to happen more and more. I made that. You've got places to connect with. Think about programs to look at something that you have, whether it's in processing or the materials you have on hand, or the facilities that you have. Your chapel facility, is that welcoming to a diverse community, or is it church in your hospital or church in your prison? Ask if that's welcoming. And I think, and I'm not a chaplain, right? I'm an endorser, and I do that military ministry, but I can be harsh about stuff. But we really need to think hard within the chaplaincy about enforcement, because there are chaplains out there. The military is totally off the rails. They're not doing chaplaincy, in my opinion. A lot of individuals are, but as an institution, they're not. And there are chaplains out there doing the wrong thing. And I'm not aware of any enforcement at all for evangelism, proselytism, or just sitting on someone sitting on their hands and preaching the gospel while wearing a chaplain hat. That makes everybody look bad, and it hurts people, that are in vulnerable positions. And, I think there needs to be some hard questions about enforcement within the chaplaincy and doing something about it, because the Christian evangelists who have been in charge for a long time are not going to cede power to people like Mary Martha, who are doing good chaplaincy or, Vanessa or any of our other Humanist Society chaplains who are just doing good chaplaincy and, not carrying a cross around with them.
Well, I think we all have a great deal to think about as a result of this conversation. And I'm so grateful to have the three of you on this, because this is a topic that really merits a great deal more attention than it's gotten so far. And so I think that the lab is in a great position to sort of host that conversation and further it. And so thank you all for your time this afternoon and for sharing your experience and your expertise. I'll just remind everybody that all of the webinars are recorded, and then we post them on the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab website. And so they will stay up there indefinitely. They're free. If there are links that were posted in the chat, we'll put that up there as well. I'll put the slide that had the resources that were mentioned. And so if you would like to come and sort of check back up on a certain part of the webinar or share it with your colleagues, by all means, please do so. And get in touch. If you have other ideas for webinars, we're always happy to hear more. Once again, thank all of you for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.